So I'll tell them. The plan is to tell them like this. I'm going to be like, hey guys, to all my subscribers, I have testicular gout, right? Just make something up. And then I'm going to tell them, sympathy, oh no. And then I'm going to get them to send me checks made out to cash. And I'm just going to live off that money. You know what I mean? You don't get it? I'm lying to them. That's what I'm doing. Yeah. So, we'll see how that works. Hey, what's going on? This is the real battle from We Were Soldiers. We're about to watch that. You didn't hear any of that, did you? Video time! Dill pickle mustard and pretzel time.
This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, a free online player versus player strategy game where you can lead your nation in a modern day global conflict. Set in the present day, fighting your way to victory. In the morning of the 14th of November 1965, 16 UH-1 helicopters, Hueys, buzz over the treetops of the Central Highlands in Vietnam. Each carries 5 young men into battle. They're flying into an area where they have only vague intelligence on enemy dispositions and numbers. At the beginning of the US involvement in the Vietnam War, the men have little experience of the larger, fanatical and hard North Vietnamese force that awaits them. 3 weeks earlier, in October, the People's Army of Vietnam, also known as the North Vietnamese Army or NVA, launches a new offensive against the Pleiku province of South Vietnam. NVA Major General Chu Huy Man believes that if he can destroy the South Vietnamese forces in the region, along with any US reinforcements, the NVA can gain control of the Pleiku province.
Quick note, this was a stupid war for America. I'm going to get off my soapbox now. That's just my opinion. I'm sure maybe there's some people out there who are like, that was the best war. I loved that war. It was terrible. It was stupid, pointless. Video.
The first complete US division to deploy to Vietnam, the 1st Cavalry Division, has been deployed in the region since September. General Man's forces have completed their trek down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, through Laos and Cambodia, and launch a siege against Plai My, the HQ of the South Vietnamese Army's II Corps. However, the siege is a trap, intended to bait a joint US and South Vietnamese armoured column to move to Plai My from Pleiku to relieve the defenders. The NVA's 32nd Regiment sets up an ambush and hits the relief column en route on October the 23rd. Despite giving the column a mauling, the 32nd Regiment sustains heavy casualties. With the Plai My siege also a failure, defeated, the NVA begin a fighting withdrawal to the Cambodian border. While the British and French have successfully employed the concept during the Malayan Emergency and Algeria respectively, helicopter air mobile is an unproven concept within the US military. Major General Harry Kinnard, commander of 1st Cavalry, sees this as an opportunity to demonstrate the potency of his helicopter-borne air cavalry division by hunting down and rapidly deploying infantry against the retreating Vietnamese forces hidden in the forests.
Air cavalry. It just sounds, it's one of those things, yeah, you're going to use helicopters for that, and I understand they do, but air cavalry. I know I'm sure that everyone else has probably heard that term. I haven't at this moment. But yeah, just thought that was pretty cool.
To do so is requiring massive use of aviation fuel, and General Westmoreland authorises the 1st Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division as a high priority for precious fuel logistics in Vietnam. Despite this, the pursuit descends into farce, and after nearly 3 weeks of burning large amounts of aviation fuel, desperately needed elsewhere in the war, 1st Brigade have only achieved small-scale skirmishes and ambushes against the retreating force, and not a knockout blow. Frustrated with the lack of results, Kinnard replaces 1st Brigade with 3rd Brigade on the 9th of November, and with an embarrassing unforeseen NVA attack on the 3rd Brigade CP itself on the 12th, the division desperately needs some kind of result. With 3rd Brigade taking over, Intel sharing improves with the division's parent corps,
Sorry.
and 3rd Brigade is alerted to a communist assembly area on the Chupong Mountain to the west, holding at least 3 NVA regiments. Under pressure from the increasingly impatient General Westmoreland, 3rd Brigade Commander Colonel Tim Brown tells 3rd Brigade's 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry Regiment Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore to take his battalion to search the east edge of Chupong the next day. Only 24 hours later, the helicopters are now approaching the area. US artillery from a nearby temporary firebase opens fire on various clearings in the forest as a deception to any NVA forces watching. As the helicopters close in, the artillery opens fire on the intended landing zone clearing itself, LZ X-ray. A single white phosphorus shell signals the end of the barrage, clearing the first helicopters to land. 16 Hueys deliver 80 men.
That's basically a bombing campaign to, if there are any Vietnamese, I'm not going to call them enemy, but if there are Vietnamese soldiers there, it's going to get them to scatter to get the hell out of there so that the Americans can land. Am I understanding that properly?
In the first wave, most of Bravo Company and the battalion command group, including Lieutenant Colonel Moore and Sergeant Major Basil Plumley. The clearing is only wide enough to accommodate 5 Hueys at a time. Moore knows the plan is dangerous. He knows that there are likely enemy battalions in the area, but has no idea of the strength of enemy forces in the immediate vicinity. And as the Hueys complete their drops, he knows that they now have a 30-minute round trip to collect the next wave of troops and deliver them to his location. Bravo Company moves to the northwest side of the LZ, towards the mountain. Moore sets up his CP in the centre, next to a wide and hard termite mound. General Mann's forces are taken by surprise. A platoon from B Company captures a single enemy soldier an alarmingly close 100 metres to the west of the LZ. Under interrogation, he says there are 3 NVA battalions nearby, and they're very keen to kill Americans. General Mann is probably on the west side of Chupong in Cambodia, and not physically nearby to directly command his troops. He deploys his deputy, Nguyen Hu An, to take direct control, but he won't arrive at the scene for several hours. Not knowing that the Americans were coming, and therefore not knowing where they would land, various regiments are scattered around the area. None have their regimental commanders nearby at the time the first Americans land. Some may be at the central command post with General Mann. The NVA's 9th Battalion of the 66th Regiment is closest to X-Ray, and cautiously advances towards the landing site from the northwest. The 66th Regiment as a whole is the same size as Moore's battalion. Much will depend on how quickly the 66th react to the Americans' presence, before the rest of Moore's battalion can be choppered in. By 12:10 PM, the rest of Bravo Company and Alpha Company have been delivered to LZ X-Ray in 2 further waves of Hueys. Bravo moves northwest, searching for contacts. With only their company commanders present, the NVA's 9th Battalion of the 66th Regiment has massed nearby. With only 2 of his 4 companies at the LZ, Moore aggressively orders Bravo to move up the mountain to clear any resistance, still believing he's conducting an offensive operation. Bravo's 2nd platoon moves out, and almost immediately runs into the 66th Regiment's assembly area. A fierce firefight begins, and 2nd platoon is immediately pinned down and cut off from the rest of Bravo Company. Bravo's commander spots and radios back to Moore that there are large numbers of NVA now attacking his position, with his left flank vulnerable. The NVA waste no time in moving around the southern flank, knowing that the Americans are at their weakest before more reinforcements can arrive. Alpha moves forward.
Has anyone seen this movie, We Were Soldiers? It's a great movie. Where is my goddamn... There. It's a great movie. It really is a good movie.
Alpha moves forward to Bravo's left flank, and the now arriving C Company moves to a dried up creek bed on the battalion's south flank, under fire as soon as their boots hit the ground, clambering out of the choppers. The pinned down and lost 2nd platoon can't move. Anybody who stands or even crouches is immediately shot by the surrounding enemy they can't see. At last realising the danger of his situation, at 1:45 PM, Moore calls in airstrikes, artillery and Huey-fired rocket barrages on the mountainside behind the front line, desperately trying to hold back the reinforcing 66th Regiment. as the F-100 Super Sabres begin to pound the mountainside with cannon and napalm strikes. An intimidating 150-man strong NVA assault begins against Charlie Company on the southern flank. The clash results in significant casualties for both sides, with Bravo and Alpha also repelling fierce assaults, also inflicting and taking heavy casualties. Charlie Company is forced to call in close artillery support against the latest mass assault along the creek bed. At 2:40 p.m, Moore stops the remaining 8 heli drops, which would have brought in the much-needed Delta Company. The fire is too heavy around the LZ, and it would be too dangerous. However, at 3 p.m, the NVA forces temporarily withdraw to regroup, and the Hueys are cleared to land. One helicopter approaches too low to the ground to avoid enemy fire and clips a tree. The airframe crashes into the ground but doesn't explode. The men of Delta Company are okay and emerge to join the fight. Fighting resumes at 3:20. A platoon of Delta Company immediately joins the fight in the southwest where Charlie have been taking massive casualties. The 66th makes a renewed assault on the small Delta contingent. 2 MGs of Alpha Company help to hold off the attack, which nearly breaks a hole through the line. The rest of Delta Company moves to the east and north to finally complete the 360-degree perimeter. At 3:45, Moore orders another push to the lost platoon. Pinned down by an NVA machine gun position, Lieutenant Marm of 2nd Platoon, A Company, fires an LAW and, alone and under fire, charges the nest with grenades. He kills 12 at the MG nest. Hit in the jaw and neck, he is later awarded the Medal of Honor.
Wow.
Alpha and Bravo Company's push doesn't work, however, and they withdraw back to the LZ. As night falls, both sides dig in. Throughout the day there have been 88 US casualties. Skirmishes continue overnight, but Bravo Company's lost platoon repels 3 assaults with the help of an overflying AC-47 fixed-wing gunship. The 2nd Battalion of the 7th and the 2nd
I don't remember the gunship in the movie. I could be wrong.
Battalion of the 5th Cavalry Regiments are to be lifted to nearby LZ Victor overnight.
This is also saying that the movie would be 100% accurate, and I understand it might not be, sure.
To reinforce Mortar Battalion at X-Ray by foot. B-52 strikes from Guam are requested for the next day. Their time on target will be 4 p.m. The fighting pauses in the early morning. Day breaks on the 15th of November. At 6:40 a.m, Moore deploys a patrol to proceed 200 meters south of their perimeter to find the enemy. They barely make it 50 meters, when their presence triggers another assault by the now larger NVA force. The Vietnamese appear from the tall grass very close to the American line.
In the movie, every time the Vietnamese, if you haven't seen it, every time the Vietnamese are going to charge, you hear whistles like sport whistles, like referee whistles, and in the movie it could be quiet, and all of a sudden some shooting happens, and then and you just hear that, and I just remember watching it in the theater, and I was just thinking, oh shit, okay, and every time you started to hear that whistle, when they were just coming in waves like oceans at the beach, you know what I mean, just that wave crash, and then the next one it pulls back, and the next one and they just kept coming and coming, and you kept hearing that whistle, and all I thought of was, as an American, I thought of the Civil War and the rebel yell. I've heard it on YouTube. Soldiers, Confederate soldiers who would reenact it back in the 1910, 1920s, and they would do their best to hear it, and then you'd hear Union soldiers who would say, man, when we heard that rebel yell, you just got to chill up your spine. And you hear that and you're kind of like, okay, whatever, but then you hear this whistle, and I know it's not the same thing, but you hear that whistle and they're coming, and just like this, they're going to keep charging you. You're going to kill, probably in the span of a day, one soldier. You're probably going to feel like you killed 30 of their guys. You didn't make a dent. All of you on the line feel like you've wiped out hundreds of thousands of people, and yet the next day that whistle blows and they're still charging. You're kind of like, where are they coming from? Were they making these guys overnight? I mean, in the movie, that whistle was good. Sam Elliott was good. Mel Gibson was good. Everyone was good in that movie.
Having crawled through the undergrowth to launch a surprise close quarters attack.
Look at him.
While the Vietnamese 9th Division has broken and fled through the night after their losses the day before, the fresh 7th Battalion has now arrived to face Moore's exhausted men. Fire cuts through C Company and into Moore's CP itself. Again, C Company is taking heavy casualties, and the American perimeter is in serious danger of being overrun. Specialist Willard Parrish of C Company finds himself situated between D and C Company lines with his M60 light machine gun. So desperate is their situation, he expends all of his M60 ammunition trying to hold the enemy back. He then stands up with a 45 handgun in each hand and continues to repel the advancing NVA just 20 yards from his foxhole. He would later be awarded a Silver Star. However, the front line to the south continues to collapse. Just 30 minutes after the fighting began, Moore's forward air controller, Lieutenant Charlie Hastings, senses disaster and instinctively transmits a radio message to his US Air Force counterparts that he hopes will prevent the impending overrun.
Broken arrow.
Each US platoon pops smoke to identify their positions on the ground. Hastings later recalls, "I used the code word Broken Arrow, which meant American unit in contact and in danger of being overrun, and we received all available aircraft in South Vietnam for close air support. We had aircraft stacked up at 1,000 foot intervals from 7,000 to 35,000 feet, each waiting to receive a target and deliver their ordnance." While there would later be confusion over the use of the phrase Broken Arrow, a phrase ordinarily used to indicate an accidental event involving nuclear weapons, it's likely that it is also being used locally in Vietnam as a distress call. The next 3 hours see a massive and decisive use of overwhelming air power, not only against troops overrunning Moore's battalion, but against the North Vietnamese soldiers still making their way over the Chu Pong Massif to join the fight. Among the airstrikes, 3 F-100 Super Sabres drop 6 napalm canisters and 6 bombs within 100 metres of the front line. The same 3 aircraft then rotate in and out, dispensing 2,400 20mm cannon rounds into the NVA troops' overwhelming C Company. The US Air
I want to watch this movie again now. That was the easiest ad I've ever
The
done.
US Air Force, Navy and Marine Corps aircraft pound the enemy from the air, and artillery rains down from above dangerously close to the American troops. With the chaos, smoke, explosions and flame now engulfing the battlefield, a new pair of F-100s scream in towards LZ X-ray. Moore looks up in horror to see the nose of the aircraft pointing straight towards him. He screams at Hastings to call the aircraft off, but it's too late.
Yeah.
The leading
remember
Super
this.
Sabre releases 2 6-foot-long metal canisters that for an eternity tumble around in the air as they fall to the ground. In an instant, everything near the CP burns. It's a miracle that only 3 of his men are hit.
If you've seen the movie, you remember one particular scene right after that happens. There was the one guy, I want to say he was like an Asian guy, an American, and he kind of befriended the photographer, Pepper, Barry Pepper, the real name of the actor, not the guy, but he befriends him, and that guy gets damaged from that napalm, and they go to pick him up, and he grabs the guy's legs to lift him up, and it was like, imagine if you haven't seen the movie, then cover your ears, because this is disgusting and brutal. Okay, we're gonna go now. He grabs it and goes to lift, and his hand slips, and all the skin buckles up behind the hand as he's lifting, like it just peels away. Oh, it was so disgusting. I remember at the theater mid handful of popcorn when that happened, and I was like, I was so disgusted. I still ate the popcorn, but I waited, out of respect for that guy's legs. Oh, that was a terrible scene. Damn it, I want to watch that movie now.
The second F-100 had heard the radio warning in time, and pulls away without releasing its napalm on Moore's CP itself. Lieutenant Colonel Moore senses that Forward Air Controller Hastings is shocked by what has just happened, and reassures him, "Don't worry about that one, Charlie, just keep them coming." The pounding continues all day. The fresh NVA 7...
After something like that, man, I understand, hey look, that was a rogue one, that's not your fault. But you feel, yeah, it's my fault. That's my fault. You lost 3 guys, that's my fault. That's on me.
9th Battalion takes such overwhelming fire from artillery and airstrikes that, like the 9th Battalion the day before, it has been stopped in its tracks. With a lull in the fighting, Moore requests that a company from 1st Battalion's sister 2nd Battalion be helicoptered in immediately. These fresh infantrymen are deployed to help the heavily battered C Company on the southern perimeter. At noon, the reinforcing 2nd Battalion 5th Cavalry, who had been airlifted to LZ Victor earlier that morning, also arrives to bolster Moore's perimeter. It becomes evident that the balance of power in the area has shifted, and the NVA 7th Battalion has taken such heavy losses from airstrikes that it can no longer continue. With the new US battalion on the scene, and with ground fighting seemingly over for the day, Moore's exhausted battalion prepares for exfil back to base in the afternoon. The B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers from Guam arrive high overhead at 4 p.m. Several entire map grid areas over the Chupong Massif have been marked for destruction, aiming to halt the advance of the NVA's 33rd Regiment and the remainder of the 66th to the area. 18 US Air Force B-52Fs drop 900 500-pound bombs across the area.
Jesus.
Known as arc-light strikes, the B-52s will return to area bomb the suspected NVA locations every day for 7 days. Over 96 sorties, 5,000 bombs will be dropped. With a final artillery barrage, the lost 2nd Platoon is rescued at 4:15 p.m. With another smaller skirmish taking place in the early hours of the following morning, the 2-day fight at LZ X-Ray has seen 79 Americans killed and 121 wounded. The NVA would estimate their losses at 1,215, predominantly as a result of the massive air campaign waged against them. After a brief skirmish the following morning, Moore's men are choppered out of LZ X-Ray, leaving battalions from the 5th and 7th Cavalry Regiments on the ground in the area. 3rd Brigade Commander Colonel Brown is worried that further NVA formations are moving into the area and calls for a withdrawal, but General Westmoreland orders the 2 battalions to stay, wanting to avoid giving the appearance of retreat to the NVA and the US press. The fresh battalions are ordered to move out on foot towards LZ Columbus and LZ Albany, both 2 miles away, vacating the area in time for a B-52 strike against Chupong and LZ X-Ray itself the following day. At this moment, General Westmoreland does not yet know how deadly this decision will be, as in the long grass near LZ Albany, an NVA battalion lies in wait. Thanks again to our sponsor, Conflict of...
This is part 1, but I can't find part 2. So, I'll keep looking, but this is pretty good. Then again, I don't know about I just know when they get airlifted out, so I don't know what part 2 would be, because it wasn't in the movie. So, I hope you enjoyed that, because that was pretty good. And till next time, have a good day, have a good night.